this presentation, which is part of an ongoing GOOS webinar series exploring issues and projects associated with global sustained ocean observing. My name is Albert Fisher. I'm the director of the GOOS office, the Global Ocean Observing System Office, which is based at the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in Paris. And I'm the moderator today, but today I'm coming to you from the office of Katie Hill, who's next to me at the World Meteorological Organization. And that's very appropriate since we're talking today about a joint activity between IOC and WMO related to JCOMM, and also because Katie provides secretarial support to the JCOMM Observations Coordination Group. So for the next hour, we're going to start with an approximately 30-minute presentation from David Legler. David is director of the Climate Observations Division of the NOAA Climate Program Office in the USA, and he is the chair of the JCOMM Observations Coordination Group, or OCG. So in GOOS, we consider the JCOMM OCG as one of the legs of, main legs of, along with the GOOS regional alliances, of the coordination of the implementation of the in-situ observing networks that are a core contribution to GOOS. So after David's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session by chat. I'll moderate and select the questions verbally. And the chat window is open. You can see it on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So if you have any clarifying questions or questions that pop up along the way, please feel free to type them already. So this session is being recorded, and we'll post the recording as well as the presentation on the GOOS website after this webinar. So David, without further ado, let me turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Albert. Just an audio check, make sure everything, you can hear me okay? Great. All right, so thank you very much for the opportunity today to talk about the Observations Coordination Group. And my purpose today, let's see, advance the slides. Okay, so my objectives today are to describe the aims and the scope of the JCOMM Observations Coordination Group and what we're all about, who we are. I'd also like to convey and review the foci of the Observations Group according to our work plan that we've developed. So looking out 5 years hence, what are some of the things that we're going to be focusing our time on? And I'll bring some examples and highlight some examples of our activities. I'm also going to be describing some resources of interest to the ocean community about the ocean observing system. And lastly, I think throughout the talk today, you'll hear about some opportunities for others for the community to follow and perhaps help and engage the Observations Coordination Group and our activities for the benefit of everyone. So harking back to a presentation by Nadia Pernardi last month, who presented on JCOMM overall, of which we're a part. Nadia talked about strategic priorities, and she identified 5 different priorities that were important, or deliverables, if you will, for JCOMM. And what I wanted to point out is, of course, that all of these areas of focus, if you will, or priorities are reliant upon the observing system, as I'm sure we're all aware. And part of that observing system is make sure that the data and information are provided and that the systems are operating efficiently, and we have some ways to manage and standardize so that information can be shared across to all these different application areas. As you may recall from Nadia's presentation, in addition to an overarching management group, there are 3 sub-components to the JCOMM activities. The first is the observations area, which I'll be talking about today. That's the focus of our webinar. But I also want to draw attention to the 2 complementary activities and groups that are also that we work with. One is the data management program area, and the second is the services and forecast systems element. And so maybe soon those can also be highlighted in a webinar form. So one may ask, so what is this observation coordination group, and what does it do? So one might be curious enough to go and look into the terms of reference, and there's about 1.5 pages of text. But I know we're all very busy, so one could shorten somewhat the terms of reference to a briefer set of documents or bullets But I've gone even further, so I've tried now to reduce those to a set of 4 different foci areas, if you will. So here's what the Observations Coordination Group is effectively doing. We are focusing on reviewing and advising on the effectiveness, coordination, operation of observing systems. So in some sense, really the technical implementation arm of JCOMM. We're advising on possible observing solutions, including consideration and trade-offs of new technologies to meet emerging new requirements. And that's something that we're charged to do. Secondly, we're really charged to develop and encourage following of particular standards for observing, for instrumentation, for traceability, even for data and metadata to some extent. So we are the group that's overseeing that implementation of the observing system and the pieces that fit into these and follow the standards. Thirdly, we're tied at the hip with the WMO, so we're really supporting a number of engagements with the WMO in terms of supporting their development of the WMO Integrated Observing System, WIGOS, the support of the Commission for Basic Services, requirements collection, a whole range of, we're also working with the data program area to support a number of data and metadata standards and so forth. So we're really serving as that interface to WMO. And lastly, we're also involved in capacity development activities, not only identifying the requirements, but there is a wide range of activities within OCG that I won't have time to talk about today, but they're scattered across the observing enterprise and probably worth a webinar of their own. So I would say in sum that we spend a lot of time worrying about best practices and standards, and we spend a lot of time worrying about the operations of the observing system and how effective they are and how efficient they are. We look to, in our terms of reference, call out that our requirements for JCOMM include those from GCOS, from GOOS, and the WMO Commission for Basic Services for weather and marine forecasting. We carry out our activities through meetings, through communications, but we're also allowed to form expert teams, smaller task teams, and even small pilot projects. So who are we? Well, the Observations Coordination Group is comprised of a number of different communities. We incorporate in our group a number of these observing networks pictured here. So and I'll talk about these more in detail, but they cover a wide range of primarily global ocean observing enterprises or networks, including the Data Buoy Cooperation Panel, which is looking at our surface drifters, a series of moorings, regional buoy networks, a whole team devoted towards ship-based observations, including VOS and shipboard XBT launches and even aerosol launches. The Global Sea Level Observing System, so looking at that global network of tide gauges, Argo, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, Ocean Sites, which is a community of practice looking at a set of fixed site moorings around the world. A GOSHIP, which is a series or an effort to on deep hydrography sections sustained over time. And finally, our interaction with the International Ocean Carbon Coordination Project and all the range of ocean carbon measurements. So in addition to those observing networks, we are also engaged with some regional marine instrument centers. These are RMICs, and these are, I would say, centers of expertise. There are now 2 of them, one in China and one in the US, focusing on instrumentation, calibration, and enhancing and advancing our calibration standards and use of those standards across our various networks. We also are fortunate and have been developing capabilities for monitoring and managing the systems through a center called JCOMM Ops, which I'll talk a bit more about here in a minute, and also the Observing System Monitoring Center here in the US that's been helping us look at monitoring the health of the networks and also now working more towards integration of various data streams. And looking ahead, we also recognize that there are a number of emerging observing systems that are on the horizon or active, and we need to engage. So just recently we have engaged with the international collider community, and I'll talk more about that in a later slide. And we've also engaged now with the coastal networks and the GOOS regional alliances, and we're again looking at perhaps additional networks might be coming, have some linkage with the OCG. So one might ask, hey David, so hey, these networks are doing pretty good. Why do we need an OCG to overlook all this? And so I would just pose the question. This is a recent depiction of the Global Ocean Observing Enterprise. And so this depiction indicates there are nearly 7,000 different platforms on the global oceans today, operated by a large number of countries and operators. So over the last 3 decades, due to the hard work of a lot of folks throughout the world, we now have a global ocean observing system that is, in order to operate it effectively and efficiently and deliver the information and enable capabilities and services that are so important, some management oversight is required. So OCG is helping to serve part of that need. I was asked, I was trying to think about a good way to convey sort of the OCG role in the context of other groups. So here's my first attempt at this. So in looking at just that observing networks versus JCOMM OCG versus GOOS, let's say, so I've carved off 5 different areas of coordination or engagement, if you will, and tried to highlight where I think that these are that these groups have some responsibility. So I think in terms of requirements, we are looking to GOOS to really provide that set of requirements and help advise on what the observing system really should be addressing. In terms of standards, again, I think we see that the networks and especially are developing some standards of their own, and JCOMM and OCG have some responsibility and are actively engaged in applying those standards across the various networks so that we can have measurements of like variables be interoperable and integratable. In terms of operations, again, that's a focus of the networks, and again, looking at the OCG, we're also engaged in that to try to find efficiencies and make sure the system's operating effectively, efficiently. And I think the OCG also has a unique role, particularly with regards to integration across the platforms, with regards to operations, even with regards to data and so forth. And then I think lastly, the ties to the WMO are a fairly unique attribute for the JCOMM activities. So let me talk, I'm going to walk through about 5 different areas of emphasis, if you will, from the OCG work plan. This is available on our website. We're tracking progress in a number of areas. I'm going to highlight 5. This is not everything we do, but I do want to talk through these to give you a flavor of what the Observations Coordination Group has been doing and what we're looking forward to doing in the next 5 years. So I'm going to be talking a bit about our participation in the requirements process, also talking about observing system operations, the development of standards and best practices, and our links to WMO. Then we're going to talk about tracking and improving performance and what that means, the importance of integration and interoperability, and finally just talk a bit about what might lie ahead for observational data, information, and products. So in terms of requirements, we, as many of you may know, the Global Climate Observing System has been actively developing and will soon be releasing for public comment their implementation plan to satisfy the requirements for the climate community. And so are the networks. We have facilitated some of those conversations and provided some guidance there in that process. We've also been engaged in conversations with GOOS on developing specification sheets on overall GOOS requirements and also with regards to capabilities by specific observing networks. And the anticipation there is that GOOS is now trying to develop these overarching requirements and capabilities in order so we can better map the observing capabilities and to meet those requirements as a system. And finally, we're also working with the WMO. We have regular conversations at our meetings with them, contributing towards WMO's collection of requirements, and the rolling requirements review is what they call it, and they even have a capabilities tool there. So that's we're also trying to contribute that. So we're essentially contributing the ocean component to that set of activities. So let me talk a bit about the type of activities we engage with the particular networks. Again, just a reminder, these are the networks that we've been talking to on a regular basis. And some of the things that we concern ourselves with during our meetings and intersessionally is looking at these networks and trying to monitor their performance, worrying about the data and metadata flow, telecommunications challenges, just the logistics of getting observational platforms serviced, turned around, deployed. We're increasingly trying to identify threats and risk, links to WMO and so forth. So we're really, again, that technical arm looking at the operation of the systems that we've been working with and then integration. And I think there's a lot of synergies that can be achieved by looking across these various networks, as I'll point out too in the coming couple slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through rather quickly a number of the observing networks and some of their activities. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but these will be available in the presentation, so you can go back and look and spend some more time perusing these with some of the advancements and things I'd like to draw notice to. I'm not going to spend time to cover all the networks. I just don't have the time to do that, but I just give you a flavor here. So the first one I want to start with is the drifting buoy, data buoy cooperation panel, in particular this drifting buoy network. So again, the status report as of a few months ago, over 1,500 drifting buoys, providing a lot of information in real time on sea surface temperature, air pressure, and other variables. So one of their achievements is now they have now made some changes in that network, and they are now reporting their data onto the GTS in a new format. It's called Buffer. It provides some means of providing a more complete data set in real time, as we were somewhat limited in the past of how much data could be reported. So they have made that conversion. And one thing you'll note throughout the next several slides is we've been trying to emphasize the development of key performance indicators. And these are indicators of how the network is doing in terms of their performance, identifying risk, achievements, and so forth. And so they have identified this particular network has divided some KPIs and are now starting to report those on a monthly basis. So the next is also a data buoy cooperation panel effort on the moored buoy network. So this is our tropical array and a number of moorings in coastal and national waters. And here I would point out that they are also transferring and making some changes to report all of their data in this buffer format. And so they haven't quite made it all the way there, but they're making good progress. Next is I want to talk a couple slides about our ship observations team. So in terms of the BOS fleet, so again, a reminder, we have several thousand ships that are reporting on a somewhat regular basis. I would point out here the news that through a European effort, some additional automated weather stations are going to be added to the mix here. So some 400 new stations are going to be added, which is pretty exciting. And so one of the challenges we're finding in this using ships is we don't have a real good way of uniquely identifying ships. And this is particularly of importance to not only the VOS fleet, but to the carbon community and others who perhaps want to utilize ships for their observational platforms, and trying to organize a coherent approach to that. First, we need to figure out what we're calling these ships, so when we're talking about a particular ship, we all are talking about the same one. And so we're making some progress in that area across OCG. So there's also ships that are deploying XBTs. So last year, 14,000 XBTs have been deployed. Part of the conversation that's happening now is brought about by OCG is that we're encouraging more conversations between the PCO2 community and the SUP community, as some of those platforms are likely good candidates for the PCO2 systems and so forth. GoShip, our effort to do repeat particular transects, they have now identified a new set of classes set of classes for contributions of hydrography that may not be quite fit the GoShip standards, And so we think that's going to really contribute additional number of hydrographic casts to our data sets and so forth, which is really exciting. And this community is also developing some KPIs to help monitor and track their performance and improve it. And Argo, I think Argo is a pretty well-known network. Over 10,000 observations per month. 85% reported within 24 hours, and that number will go up as the old Argo system makes way for the iridium telecommunications capabilities. And lastly, the GOOS Network. So again, there, continuation of upgrading stations with GPS, and we're continuing to monitor that. So one might ask the question, so why would a network want to become part of the JCOMM OCG? Well, here are some reasons why. Opportunity to coordinate with other networks, maximizing real-time reporting delivery, encouraging the development and use of standards throughout the system, developing those linkages to WMO for reasons that might be national or international in scope, and exploiting our ties across JCOMM with the data management services activities are just some of the reasons. In terms of, I've already alluded to, the observing system is not static, additional networks are coming online. So in terms of our development and the way we see the way going forward is we're already approaching other groups about engaging with us, and we're really focusing on those networks we feel are complementary to the existing efforts, particularly those focused around the UAVs. We have some experience with as a way to step out, as a way to prioritize in some sense where we're going to engage. So we've developed over the last few meetings an engagement with the carbon community. We reached out at the last meeting of the Global Glider Network, so we've asked them to come back, and so they're developing in terms of reference and a scientific steering committee. We have engaged with the GOOS regional associations and trying to establish some ties there and the nature of that relationship. An example of that is we had the HF radar community come talk to us at our last meeting, particularly about their contributions towards looking at surface currents, how they might see OCG helping them in establishing their national global network, real-time reporting, contributing towards services, particularly in wave validation and so forth. So a lot of different areas we're sort of exploring there. And we're considering our connection with the biological networks. So at our next meeting, we're likely to talk to the animal profile community and make sure that we're coordinating to the fullest extent possible. And other networks are to be determined. And so we welcome your thoughts on that with regards to other networks we might identify with. Another activity that OCG spends a lot of time on and needs to spend more time on, is really the development of best practices and standards across our networks. So again, looking at observing best practices, a lot of information is out there on our website, but some of it's a little bit dated, needs to be updated. And so we recognize we need some further effort in this. And so we feel some of the standards need updating. We have had standards submitted to us and seeking review and approval for adoption as WMO standards. We also want to engage the RMICs in a more concrete and deliberative way. And I think some of the questions about traceability across the networks, and particularly with satellites, is also a question. So here, we're looking to identify a vice chair within the community to help lead JCOMM OCG efforts in this area. We're working on terms of reference, and if you have suggestions on a qualified individual, help us with that. Please contact me or Katie Hill. That would be really helpful. Let me talk about improving performance. So, in order to improve performance, you really need to know what performance means and where you're at or currently. So one of the tools and one of the capabilities we've developed over the last several years is a center in Brest called JCOMM Ops, Observation Program Support Center. It has three aims: to assist in the implementation and deployment of the networks, to make sure that data are flowing, providing data where necessary, metadata where necessary to ensure that those data are attached, and to develop the tools to monitor the system, help provide better management capabilities and so forth. And so this center is now established, been there for a little over a year now. They have 6 staff. They have a lot of capabilities and developing some really wonderful tools. And I want to just highlight a few of those capabilities here in the next couple slides. So they do have a web tool, jcommops.org. Its target audience is really the set of network operators who are managing the implementation and monitoring the performance of the network. but you can get a lot of information there about the networks that we've talked about here today. And so we're working on tracking network status and key performance indicators through this tool across the entire range of networks within the OCG. And just a few examples of these types of performance indicators. So here are some from the Data Buoy Cooperation Panel on coverage of drifting buoys, tracking of publications by the ocean sites community, some KPIs on the bottom right from the VOS fleet on the number of ships that are active and so forth. Bottom left is coverage of ships for a given period. This is particularly last year. If one were to look at some indicators for Argo, these are a few examples. On the upper left about the implementation and data flow, and tracking by color, how well they're doing, very good or average. And I presume red means it's an area of concern. Upper right tells us about the distribution of national contributions towards the Argo fleet. The lower left is a depiction of Argo float age in years. So again, tracking how aged the Argo floats are. And the bottom right tells something about the coverage. So again, using these tools, we can have a much more efficient system for these particular networks. And the goal is to then standardize these, use these tools across the various networks and perhaps come up with some standards of reporting and monitoring and tracking to improve the system overall. Let me talk about integration and interoperability. So this is an important topic for OCG. It's still a challenge for us as the networks have grown up independently, so we're still challenged by the nature of trying to get these groups to work more collaboratively and identifying common problems that the OCG can help address. One of those, as I've alluded to, is the use of the VOS fleet. So we've had expressions, and we know that the VOS fleet are used for in a number of the different networks, and a number of communities are increasingly coming forth and asking about using the VOS fleet or wanting to coordinate their access to the ships and so forth. So one of the things that activities we are undertaking at the moment is trying to coordinate our efforts better across the OCG in terms of fleet usage, identifying the needs, potential uses, coordinating with ships in terms of getting on the ship, the types of equipment that needs to be on the ship, and also how do we engage as a community with ship operators so we don't come to them with 10 different groups and 10 different plans, but could we come to that community of ship operators and say, here's a set of requirements and needs and a set of instruments that we could perhaps develop and implement more widely on their fleets and increase the standardization and perhaps resiliency of that particular network. So we have some ideas focused on that. So JCOMM Ops is helping us focus on that. We're engaged with a number of the networks in these discussions, and we're hoping to have some dialogue with ship operators and others in about a year's time. Another effort we had a discussion about last time, it's a services-oriented intra-OCG effort. So we had a discussion with our services program area colleagues about waves, and then we talked to our observing colleagues and networks about their capabilities in terms of measuring waves. Talked a bit about the requirements and recognized that requirements are probably well articulated, but observing technologies have advanced over the last 10 years, and so we're asking ourselves, could we do more and better in terms of addressing those requirements with current technologies? And then with regards to the services, are we sufficiently plugged into that services arena so they can provide the feedback necessary to tell us if we're doing well or not well? And so those are conversations that are continuing. We're planning a brief side meeting at an upcoming meeting in October for the DBCP meeting in La Jolla. And last two things here are a synthesis effort using a particular web tool, which I'll talk about here in just a second, and then an open access GTS project. So I have a slide dedicated to that. So one of the projects we've been encouraging is how do we integrate with these particularly with real-time data that are now somewhat on GTS and sometimes available elsewhere? How can we best integrate across data that are distributed in various data centers or various places? And there are a number of tools and abilities to do that. And one of the things that's come about through our experience in NOAA is a tool called ERDAP. It's a set of services, and so we're at the OSMC in Seattle at PMEL. We have some now demonstrations of how this tool could help integrate across these various data streams. So this is a depiction of data across a number of different networks facilitated by this tool, and it's accessible by just a quick 1 or 2 lines of code. So this is a really powerful kind of tool, and so we're encouraging the further development of these kinds of tools within OCG and also within other regions and other parts of JCOMM. And lastly, we are starting under the encouragement of Nadia, who encouraged us to think about and recommended and is leading, helping co-lead this effort to open up access to the GTS, both in terms of facilitating a wider capability to insert data on the GTS and also to get access to some of those data. And so JCOMM Ops is again going to be central to, I think, to the insertion ideas here we have here is we believe that they are going to be capable of issuing WMO IDs. And so I think there's some new capabilities there. And I think the access to GTS is an important tool we want to be able to provide, and there are probably some capabilities out there that we're aware of. I'm not sure they're terribly robust. So we're going to, through this next year, we're going to try to identify those and also develop some more robust capabilities in that area. All right, so a bit about the future of OCG. We, as I think alluded to, the issue of increased integration is incredibly important, and I think integration and interoperability both combined. So we have an ever-expanding suite of networks. We have regional networks. We have the bio community coming to us, and so that question about integration is always going to be key. As we think about our range of observing platforms, the logistics to service those platforms, to deploy them in an efficient way, is really going to rely upon the networks cooperating with each other to make that an efficient process and identifying the resources necessary to achieve it. I think pie in the sky is thinking about how we observe for a particular EOV, and that's not something OCG will determine by itself, but it was certainly, I think the networks involved will want to play a role in those discussions. We have a number of observing groups who are going and developing recommendations for future observing changes. So the TPOS effort in the Pacific, the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, which is evolving, the Southern Ocean Observing System, Atlantos. So these efforts are going to be recommending some changes, and JCOMM OCG is going to be listening very carefully to their recommendations, and we need to think about how to incorporate those changes and recommendations. We're well aware of a range of new technologies on the horizon, and incorporating those is something we're increasingly thinking about. As I've indicated, we're also thinking about how best to contribute towards integrated data products and information. I think the shift from ship-based enterprise and somewhat dwindling resources in terms of global class ships and new era of autonomous platforms is bringing new capabilities, but we're going to have to work this really hard. Again, it goes back to that maintaining our capabilities and recognizing risk ahead of time. And I think working within JCOMM to improve the contributions to the overarching aims of JCOMM towards the climate, marine services, and ocean health, which are also central to GOOS. How are we best going to contribute there? And so lastly, in summary, so I just want to emphasize that the OCG is providing that technical support, coordination, and oversight of a growing number of global ocean observing networks. We've seen marked advancement and the ability to monitor the performance of the various observing networks. We're seeing increased standardization, and our aim is to develop that suite of metrics that one can monitor and improve these performance across the entire network in a way that reflects the integration of all of these networks. And JCOMM Ops is a great, wonderful new resource. It's providing capabilities that we so desperately need. It's providing ways for us to monitor and track the health of the networks and increasing our performance and efficiency of the networks. And lastly, talking about the integration operability here, it's really important. So we're focusing on these standards and perhaps some web tools that are our initial foray into that arena, but there's much more to be done. And so with that, I'll conclude by acknowledging a lot of help and engagement in OCG, but I especially want to thank Katie Hill and Long, who are helping us really make OCG a success, and couldn't do it without you. So thank you very much. Thank you, Albert, for the opportunity again.
Thanks
I'm glad to
very
take
much,
questions.
David. And as David said, please go ahead and fire away with questions in the chat. And you can see from David's presentation really why we think of the JCOMM OCG as one of the main engine rooms for GOOS. Really for the basin scale unified networks, but also increasingly to help with implementation and global approaches that really help all of the implementers that participate in the activities of the OCG. So let me, we've lost the chat window. Well, we have a different chat window, so I'll remember the questions that I saw in the previous chat window. So let me ask the first one that I saw, which was, you've mentioned satellites only once, David. How does all these observing activities integrate with the satellite observations of the ocean surface?
That's a great question. So I think that's a challenge for us, and I probably should have highlighted it. We recognize the criticality of satellites and providing global coverage and global capabilities that the in-situ network can't provide. And so naturally, when one thinks about services or products and information, satellites have to be an integral part of that. I would say within JCOMM, that's still a struggle for us to address. We recognize it's been on our radar screen for a while. For example, I would say that there are examples of that exchange and dialogue. So within the Data Buoy Cooperation Panel, there have been exchanges and dialogue with regards to how well the data buoys are contributing towards validation of satellite products. What I'd like to see is a wider discussion of that, not just within DBCP, but across OCG, as we're now seeing satellite products are eager to utilize a number of observing networks. They're not wed to a particular one. And I think we have to find some ways to have that kind of conversation. So better connections with some of those communities like GRIST, the high resolution SST community, and others are probably some avenues for us to explore further.
Thanks, David. And since we lost the connection between the old chat window and this new chat window, please ask your questions in this new chat window that you see at the bottom of your screen. And I might mention just on the point of the satellites, there are pretty strong satellite coordination groups. One of them is CEOS, the Committee for Earth Observing Satellites. Another one is the CGMS, the Coordination Group for Meteorological Satellites, which address the coordination and the long-term sustainability of the variables that we can measure from space. So those are groups that GOOS at a higher level and GCOS, the Global Climate Observing System, connect to. And the concept actually of defining essential variables, the essential climate variables, and the essential ocean variables has been really important in connecting to the satellite community. So let me ask Federico's question, which is, when do you intend to start with biological networks? And maybe let me add to that question, what are some of the limitations do you see when you're thinking about the biological networks? Can all of them be coordinated through JCOMM Obs?
So another great question. It's a very exciting area to see the biological community and recognize their advances over the last several years. So we are going to start we are already in conversation with the biology panel part of GOOS. And so we are anticipating inviting one or probably the Animal Profiling Network community to come to our next OCG meeting. We're well aware that that community has made a large number. It's pretty advanced in terms of reporting their data, and what we want to explore is how well that OCG can help them, and also vice versa. So if there's some synergies between that community and the other observing communities within OCG, that's what we want to mine a little bit. With regards to a wider connection with the biological networks, I think that's we're looking to the biology panel within GOOS to help identify those networks before we would reach out to them. With regards to your question, Albert, on how much can OCG do, that's why I read it. I think that's a concern that historically OCG has focused on physical measurements. We've now made that connection with the carbon community. We're trying to bring them in and engage them, but they have some of their own capabilities. So we're trying to find the efficient way to provide the synergies and also reporting capabilities that best maps onto that. I think we're a bit concerned about the resourcing of OCG and particularly of the activities like JCOMM Ops because if we start expanding the expectations and demands on their time, the resources at present are not sufficient to cover probably a large, wide-ranging network. So I think that will be a conversation we'll have to entertain and revisit on an ongoing basis over the next couple of years.
So you mentioned the work on standards and best practices, and there's a question from Krista von Hillebrand here. What resources does the OCG have for capacity building? Can we use those standards and best practices in training? For sea level stations, for example, in addition to the GLOS stations, there are dozens of tide gauges operated by many different countries, contributing to tsunami early warning and other coastal hazard warning systems, and there's lots of requests for training.
I didn't have time, and I chose not to spend time on the capacity development activities within OCG. There are several. The most prominent ones are in the Data Buoy Cooperation Panel that are pretty formal. There are workshops looking at utilization of data, observing practices, and so forth. I think but there are also, I think, a number of capacity development activities within the networks themselves. And I have to say for GLOS, I'm not as familiar with their capacity development activities. I would hope that, and we should have some further conversations within OCG about how to encourage and strengthen the range of capacity development activities within those networks. And this is probably something I know, Albert, that the GOOS Steering Committee meeting 2 weeks ago now, we had a discussion about capacity development and maybe this observing and adoption of utilization of best practices, and particularly in places that are challenged in these particular areas, is something we could have a further discussion about.
Yeah, so one of the core concepts we talked about at the GOOS Steering Committee meeting is that we do have to, in capacity building, really be aware of the full value chain from observations through data management systems, through models or other ways of transforming data into actionable information, actually delivering services. So that whole stream should be part of capacity development to make sure that it's not isolated, that it's not something that's going to be a kind of one-time effort, and that there's some...
That has lasting impact, yeah.
So let me turn to a question from Bruce Howe, which is about the performance metrics, and maybe it's a little bit larger than JCOMM OCG, so maybe from the OPC perspective, if Katie wants to chime in, feel free to. So with respect to performance metrics in terms of a variable view and reduction of uncertainty in ocean state variables, is there a way of quantifying the percent reduction in the variance through ocean models or through data assimilation?
So I'll answer that from an OCG perspective. So in recent meetings, we have been encouraging the networks to be thinking and developing some performance metrics, if you will, that go to their sort of health of the system, but also about the use of their data. And so one of the things I think you're seeing now more prominently is that the publication count is one way to measure some utility of those networks. I think the type of metric you're talking about here in terms of reducing an uncertainty or characterizing to within a tolerance bound some variable-based thing is another really great suggestion, and I think OOPC has had some discussions about such metrics. Wearing my other program manager's hat or program director's hat, that's the kind of thing that we particularly that appeals to us a lot. So I don't know if Katie wants to offer any thoughts about that, or.
Yeah, so I think we're doing quite a bit of work within OOPC to articulate what the requirements are for by EOV. That is quite a challenging thing. They're not single numbers in a spreadsheet. It's much more nuanced than that because we have spatially varying requirements. So it's articulating what the physical phenomena within the ocean are that we need to capture. and then we can develop metrics based on our ability to capture those phenomena, and how those phenomena then measuring those phenomena enable you to deliver to particular application areas. And so we'll be developing some performance metrics around capturing those physical phenomena within the system. The other thing is, as you will see within the GCOS implementation plan this year, most of the time we've talked about requirements for why we need to measure an essential climate variable, and then the actions have been very much focused on network targets, so the need to sustain Argo and those kinds of things. This year we've also put in some actions focused on what we want the observing system to enable us to deliver. So for instance, for ocean temperature, we want to be able to deliver annual estimates of ocean heat content within a certain level of uncertainty. So that will enable us to also report on the performance of the observing system and its ability to deliver against those metrics.
So let me turn to Jennifer's question, but it's kind of, well, it's a comment and a question. So the National Weather Service's Ocean Prediction Center is aligned with the idea of improving ocean observations from satellite. There's some work with CEOS, but they would like to see some more work with the in-situ systems under OCG on the specific issue. And she's raising the issue of spectrometers in future systems, so ocean color. And is there any activity in OCG or related to ocean color?
I don't know.
Well, so let me answer. So there because we just we had a big discussion 2 weeks ago at the GOOS Steering Committee about ocean color and light in the ocean more generally as an important variable for biogeochemistry, an important variable for biology. It's actually a physical measure. So we have made a determination that the GOOS biogeochemistry panel is going to take on this responsibility for ocean color and renew the link with the International Ocean Color Coordination Group. So you will see some, not specifically linked to OCG, even though the IOCCP, the GOOS biogeochemistry panel, is a member of OCG. I think you'll see some more effort on a global scale, specifically on linking in situ and satellite ocean color measurements.
So I answered that, but I don't know because I think there are likely to be a number of relevant measurements being made on some of our platforms within OCG, but it's not clear that those are reporting to any particular standard. I don't know, and so I would go to that ocean color group and that's or other networks. Maybe it's a GRA that can help develop those standards, but it's right now we haven't had any discussion about that. But look forward to having it.
So we have a few questions from Sid Thurston, from Lisa Beal, and from Howard Freeland, related again to the question of developing capacity and engaging new players in the observing system. Sid's asking about specific plans to reach out to new countries. Howard Freeland's making that very specific by asking whether Russia could be drawn into the Argo program, for example. And Lisa has a very specific question about the standards and best practices and how to very practically develop the capacities of scientists to take better measurements from ship-based measurements, so CTDs, ADSPs, and TSGs. David, maybe I'm going to ask you to come back to this capacity development question and think a little bit about what the individual networks might be able to offer.
So, boy, I'm really sorry I didn't have any slides on capacity development. Again, I think there are a number of capacity development activities within the networks, and I've pointed out some of the Data Buoy Cooperation Panel activities, and they have a series of workshops and that have been held in different locations. Lisa's question goes to a specific capacity with regards to observing practices and so forth. And so there my first reaction would be to point to a community of best practice that can help, such as the Ghost Ship community. And it would be my vision that each of the networks has some capacity development activities that could address these types of needs, Lisa, and that one could hope that that community would have some capacity to encourage students or experts from South Africa to spend time with on other cruises, or for experts to go to South Africa to make these kind of connections and help with that process. I can't say as I know of any specific examples where that occurs, particularly for Ghost Ship, but I know we've been encouraged them to think more about that. I know, again, with my program director's hat on, that is something that we would be willing to support at some level. So I think as OCG thinks more about this, and with the, I think, increased emphasis and leadership of GOOS, that maybe this is this capacity development enterprise across OCG is something we could take a more careful look at, particularly across the practices and capabilities across the networks, to make sure that we have a clear path forward on what we'd like to set up and what OCG can help facilitate and encourage.
And then
Howard,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. So with regards to Howard's question on Russia, I would think that Argo would be the ideal set of experts to be able to go to Russia and encourage their participation. If we feel that that's a role for OCG, let's have that conversation. Understand there are some limitations on some of us. We don't exactly have wonderful relations with Russia at the moment, but let's have that conversation.
And let me just respond also to Lisa's question on a very practical note. She can contact the Ghost Ship coordinator, Martin Kramp, at JCOMM Ops, because there's often opportunities for additional experts to join a Ghost Ship cruise, and that can be a good learning opportunity. Obviously, some travel funds will have to be identified for that, but that's the kind of thing that we can often find resources for. So let me ask you, David, some questions. I've noticed that in the audience we have a number of people coming from agencies that are very coastally focused. And you mentioned the growing links that you'd like to develop between OCG and coastal networks, GOOS regional alliances. A lot of those coastal observations also stretch into the biogeochemical and biological space. What do you think are the most natural points to start with in terms of connections between these basin scale networks that are part of OCG now and the more coastally focused networks?
Albert, that's a great question, and we're recognizing this as an opportunity as well. So we have reached out to some of the GOOS regional alliances and others in the coastal community and along a few lines, one of which is to along essentially an essential variable approach. So thinking we were well aware that, in fact, some of the networks are already entrained as part of the Data Buoy Cooperation Panel. Many of those national networks are part of that group already. I'm not sure all, but many of them are. Secondly, in our discussion, we reached out in terms of the HF radar, as we felt that was a network that was fairly well mature, had an international, global aspirations, and we felt that in terms of establishing sort of an EOV framework around surface currents and so forth, that would be an ideal network to try to marry up with some of our existing activities. With regards to the biochemistry and biology, I think that's an effort we'd like to engage with more through the IOCCP and try to identify, the points of synergy there. So it's a very malleable horizon, I would say, in terms of those engagements, and so we're certainly open to further conversation and engagement to help us. But understand, we have sort of limited bandwidth as well. So we're trying to go with where our strengths lie and try to identify synergies that we think could benefit both camps.
Thanks, David. You also talked about new technologies and the developments that really make new kinds of observations and new platforms more and more feasible. So a couple questions around that. Maybe, what are you most excited by when you do this kind of technology scan? What are the new capabilities that are coming online that really?
Wow, there's a lot. I think I'm sure autonomous vehicles are obviously a very exciting and potentially very attractive platform or set of platforms. There's in different types, some ride on the surface, or ride subsurface. So you have wave gliders, sail drones on the surface. Many of those can provide really exciting new capabilities. And I think subsurface, again, autonomous vehicles, OCG has been engaged with the deep sea cable measurements. So there's a wide range of activities, but this autonomous platform is something we're tremendously mindful of. There are some very exciting capabilities on the horizon, and I think one of the challenges will be for OCG is how do we train those activities, encourage them in a way that complements what we're already doing, and to train them in some sense in the ocean observing enterprise, but without doing a lot of a damage to the existing networks. Oftentimes, and I see this in my own organization, where the latest technology is viewed as the cheaper and more efficient alternative, and we should just implement it immediately and stop everything else. So I think that's a concern we have, and so I think it's important that we convey both the opportunities and the careful development and integration of those capabilities within the enterprise, with current capabilities notwithstanding.
So in that context, maybe I can remind people that there is a GCOS climate monitoring principle. So when we're doing observations for the creation of a climate record, amongst other reasons, one of the principles is to really have a strong period of overlap between old observing technologies and new observing technologies, so that you can be sure that what you're observing actually a change in the physical system of the climate, or in the climate system, rather than a change in the.
Yeah. So, and I would just add to that further, when I mentioned the TPOS 2020 project and Atlantis, so those are the kinds of activities that I think are going to be really helpful in bringing forth recommendations on how to evolve the system that consider the valuable contributions of satellites, which weren't there 30 years ago, they are reflecting on the new potential capabilities of these autonomous vehicles and other new platforms and sensors in a way that I think are going to be really helpful, and and they're also bringing new tools about that can help inform us based on model information or data assimilation capabilities, or just based on our knowledge of the ocean's variability that can inform us better how to develop an integrated observing system.
Thanks, David. And maybe one last question, which is a little bit linked to the conversation that Stephen and Howard are having on the chat. You raised some of the risks of the observing system as being a key point of discussion in the OBS coordination group. Do we have the right fora to raise these risks and actually change engagements on a national level? You obviously represent a lot of resources in the US, but do you have the right avenues to talk to your counterparts?
Albert, thanks. In my mind, risk includes a lot of different elements. So I think the risk you're particularly honing in on is on resourcing and the concerns that many have expressed about continuing resources for some of our key networks, and sitting in an agency that has a number of competing priorities. That's always a worry of us, of our program as well. Do we have the right fora to discuss and address those risks? I think that's a two-part question. Or two-part response. I would say that in an ideal world, we would like to have the resource folks talking to one another and have an agreed vision on what's important and what's not, and what needs to be sustained, and what the real needs are to sustain that. I don't think that fora exists, but I think the pathways are getting better. The second part of the risk is if you have a risk and a network that's not performing or suffers a calamity or a withdrawal of a major sponsor, I would hope in some respects that one day OCG could be a fora for developing the mitigation strategy to address that gap, even on a short-term basis. So we're having conversations. We had conversations about the decline in reporting from the TAL a few years ago, and that's come back. But now we're dealing with a reduction in the size of the Triton array, and we're trying to address that problem from all different avenues. But one of the avenues I think we're really struggling with is should there be a mitigation strategy to make up for those observations in some way from the other networks? And I don't think we have that. We don't have that safe place to have those kinds of conversations yet.
Okay, but I certainly welcome your optimistic attitude that we're moving in the right direction to create those fora for discussion. David, let me thank you very much for your presentation, for obviously which was representing a great deal of work by lots of different people and the observing networks. And let me thank the audience also, who's been very interactive and asked a lot of questions. And thanks, Katie, for allowing me to host this webinar in your office.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Albert. Thanks for the opportunity.